The epitome of bad theology kills is suicide. LGB youth contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth, and almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not even going to attempt to talk about mental health. But if you are an LGBT person struggling with suicidal thoughts, I want you to turn off this video right now and go to a website called thetrevorproject.org to speak with somebody who can help you. What I am going to talk about today is the history of the Catholic Church teaching on suicide, as well as what queer theologians can bring to the discussion. In early Christianity, the very first overall condemnation of suicide was written by St. Augustine of Hippo, by relating it to the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." 200 years after that statement, suicide was recognized as a sin by the Church and a formal crime by the state. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century denounced it as an act against God and as a sin for which one could not repent. And by the 16th century, those who died by suicide were forbidden Christian burial. Even attempted suicide became an ecclesiastical crime, which was punishable by excommunication and civil consequences. Today's Catholic Catechism expresses the present Church teaching on the subject. Yet with the advent of the field of psychology as well as advances in mental health studies, the Catholic Church added these 2 paragraphs. In short, the Church is now saying that a person who commits suicide may not be culpable due to illness and that we should trust in God's mercy. This compassionate response is a step in the right direction, but the Church needs to take a more active role in suicide prevention, particularly when it comes to LGBT youth. For them to say that they love the sinner but hate the sin would mean that they actually need to demonstrate care for these children. And they need to take responsibility then for the role that they play in the harmful experiences of the LGBT community. When it comes to the Bible, Judas Iscariot and King Saul are 2 less than stellar figures who actually commit suicide. Oh, and then there's that guy who supposedly accidentally fell out of a window because Paul was preaching endlessly. But nevertheless, on the surface, the Bible doesn't seem to portray any specific story dealing with marginalized people contemplating or committing suicide. Unless, of course, you're willing to look at it from a queer perspective. I like to make the case that through queer imagination, we can see Jesus wrestling with the notion of suicide as he embraced his alternative lifestyle, that is, his unconventional ministry. Mark's gospel begins with Jesus by himself approaching John the Baptist. He seemingly had left his home, his family, and there's no mention of any friends. We can see similar scenes today in the queer community. Often young people desert their homes to pursue older mentors who could help guide them through the desert, or at the very least, help them survive one more day. If this were a queer story, I guarantee you John the Baptist would have been considered a bear based on how he's described physically. Jesus goes into the desert and begins wrestling with demons, his own. First, he's tempted by food. Either he's intentionally starving himself, some extreme dieting perhaps, but thinking about cheating every now and then. To heck with that 0% body fat. He wants to have some bread, right? Or maybe he can't even afford to buy a loaf. He contemplates about giving himself to false gods through sin, crime, overindulgence. He wants to be publicly recognized, to be part of something loved and respected by this world. He desires to conquer the earth. But alarmingly, he stands at the highest point of the temple and wonders if anyone would care if he jumped. Would God save him if he leapt from this tower? In Luke's gospel, this is the 3rd and final temptation for Jesus in the desert, suggesting that maybe this is the most climactic one. Nevertheless, in all 3 temptations, it is faith that saves him. After John the Baptist is unjustly arrested, Jesus is without his mentor and is forced to return to his hometown and search for new companions. He does this by engaging with people, building a rapport, finding common ground. Perhaps these men were also marginalized by religion, repressed, or felt isolated. Nevertheless, Jesus forms with them a new kind of house, a support system as he begins this new ministry of his, this new lifestyle. Seemingly confused or maybe embarrassed by Jesus' actions, there's a peculiar account in the Synoptic Gospels when his birth family, his mother, brothers, but no mention of his father Joseph, asked to speak with him, and Jesus more or less disowns them by saying that he has a new family, one that he chose. Now, this chosen family, of course, we'll see throughout the gospel, is far from perfect, constantly failing Jesus by questioning him, disobeying him, denying him, and even betraying him. But through it all, Jesus makes it clear that he loves them. And as readers, we can see that that love is mutual. As for his birth family, it appears strained. Take his mother, for instance. In the Synoptic Gospels, she's never mentioned again after her son essentially disowns them in that previously referenced story. In the Gospel of John, she remains present throughout Jesus' adult life, even through his death, but the choice of word that Jesus uses to address her at the start of that gospel is odd, calling her woman. Jesus uses for his mother exactly the same form of address that he uses for other women that he encounters. The Samaritan woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, and Mary Magdalene. With his mom, there appears to be a lack of endearment. And as for Jesus' stepdad, Joseph, well, Christian tradition has always just assumed and consequently taught that he died before Jesus was an adult, which would explain why he's absent from the story, right? But how about another theory? Joseph either left the family or had rejected his son, Jesus. Jesus' death happened shortly after arriving in Jerusalem. Usually urban escape is a sanctuary for those rejected by family and hometown, but this wasn't the case for Jesus after constantly butting heads with religious conservatives and legal authorities who go on to bribe one of his family members to betray him. How hard up for cash was Judas that he did this to his dear friend? Before he was arrested, Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane while his friend slept. His prayer was, "Father, take this cup away from me. I don't want this burden anymore." What is the cup? Was it the fear of death? Or fear of uncertainty? His queerness? We've all prayed these types of laments before. But what is important here and now is that Jesus is surrounded by his chosen family. Albeit they're sleeping, but still, he is now surrounded by friends, immersed in faith and ministry, and now he's saying he doesn't want to die. His lifestyle had brought him to a point where he'd rather choose life than death, which is a far cry from that desert temptation we saw when he was standing on top of that tower of the temple. And again, he got this far because of faith. Some of the greatest saints in history have felt an absence of God and a lack of hope that results from that absence. In Christian spirituality, this is referred to as the dark night of the soul, and it is said that even Mother Teresa had experienced this in the latter half of her life. Following an extraordinary, singular, intimate encounter with Jesus that would go on and spark her entire ministry, she described in her writings an interior darkness, a feeling of distance from God. In my soul, I feel just that terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing. As far as we know, Mother Teresa remained in that state of dark faith and total surrender until her death. Over time, with the help of her spiritual director, she came to view the darkness as a way of identifying with Christ and his feelings of abandonment on the cross. I have come to love the darkness, for I believe it is a very, very small part of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth. Mother Teresa's persistence in light of a feeling of darkness and abandonment is a true testament of faith. A perversion of religious legal laws gets Jesus publicly executed. But the gospel story does not end with the cross, but the resurrection. And Jesus returns to his chosen family and proclaims in the very last verse of the Gospel of Matthew that all the kingdoms of heaven and earth have been given to him. If you recall, one of the 3 temptations earlier in the desert was that he thought about conquering the earth. Here we learn that Jesus indeed conquered earth and heaven too. And he did it his way. Not by giving into orthodoxies, not by giving into what his family wanted, not by giving into temptation, but through his faith.